Early scientists who studied ancient humans may have understood more than we think. An old idea, one that started in the mountains of Afghanistan and the caves of China, might change the story we tell about where humans came from. For many years, most people were taught only one simple story: modern humans evolved in Africa, traveled around the world, and replaced the earlier human groups, like the Neanderthals. In this version, Neanderthals were shown as a small, unimportant group that disappeared, but in the early days of studying human fossils, there was another idea, a bigger, more interesting story, that many scientists ignored or even made fun of. This forgotten idea is now coming back. It says that Neanderthals did not start in Europe. They may have first evolved in Asia and later moved west into Europe during a warm period. New research also shows that an older European species called Homo heidelbergensis was probably not the direct ancestor of Neanderthals. The oldest true Neanderthal fossils in Europe are about 300,000 years old, which means they may have replaced or mixed with earlier human groups who lived there before them. Another surprising idea is about faces. The modern human face, the type we have today, may actually be very old. Neanderthals were the ones whose faces changed more over time. The implications. If Neanderthals had an Asian origin, then Eurasia was the primary stage on which hominin evolution played out. What was once discarded as a fringe hypothesis is suddenly re-entering scientific discussion. Indeed, a long-dismissed theory suggests Neanderthal origins lie in East Asia. According to this theory, our evolutionary roots might be traced eastward into Central and East Asia, where the ancestors of Neanderthals developed out of Java man and Ping man during a lush and biologically rich period known as the Third Interglacial, a warm interval roughly 250,000 to 350,000 years ago. This hypothesis made extraordinary sense even before the genomic revolution. But after ancient DNA entered the picture in 2010, the genetic boundary between Neanderthals and modern humans became far more permeable than initially asserted. The public was repeatedly told that non-African people possessed only about 2 to 3% Neanderthal ancestry, implying that Neanderthals were biologically marginal. Yet, this statistic was misunderstood. This small percentage refers only to those parts of the genome that can be specifically labeled as Neanderthal-derived, ignoring the vast segments shared between both groups. Because much of the Neanderthal genome is essentially identical to that of modern humans, those segments are assigned to modern humans rather than counted as Neanderthal despite their ancient origin. Thus, the commonly quoted 2 to 3% does not reflect total ancestry. It reflects only traceable fragments. The true overlap is far deeper. As geneticist David Reich recently stated, Neanderthal ancestry could be as much as 30 or 50 or 70%. So the genetic line between Neanderthal and modern human is far blurrier than the public is led to believe. Under this framework, Neanderthals and modern humans lie on a single lineage. Their shared DNA would simply reflect uninterrupted descent with regional traits emerging and dissipating over time. The question is no longer whether they contributed some DNA. The question is whether the human-Neanderthal lineage separation was ever clean in the first place. Was the last common ancestor before the split a Neanderthal, a modern human or something else? The most parsimonious explanation suggests that Neanderthals spread west along the southern Eurasian mountains, eventually entering the Near East and Europe, where they later encountered and interwove with populations that we now classify as Homo heidelbergensis. Although it is customary today to treat this hypothesis as a relic of scientific prehistory, the truth is otherwise. Starting in the 1920s, many of the most respected anthropologists in the world argued strongly in its favor. Franz Weidenreich, who worked directly with the Java and Peking fossils, wrote that the Asian hominins and the European Neanderthals were not separate experiments, but part of a single evolutionary stream. Weidenreich was explicit. In a landmark paper written 80 years ago, he remarked that fossils from Java and China showed a sequence that suggested East-West evolution. Even more provocatively, he concluded that the eastern line showed no reasonable cause for excluding the European Neanderthalians from the evolutionary line. In other words, Neanderthals belong to the same evolutionary stream as modern humans, not a side branch. Meanwhile, out of Africa theorists taught us that Neanderthals and modern humans were completely separate. And only recently did they admit that there was interbreeding when DNA proved them wrong. Weidenreich and many others theorized that interbreeding was very likely long before they had DNA evidence. They were 100 years ahead of their time, and that is because they were able to formulate theories without the influence of an entrenched dogma. This logic guided the remarkable 1966 archaeological expedition into Afghanistan. Organized under the direction of Louis Dupree, American researchers ventured into Afghanistan to search specifically for evidence supporting the third interglacial migration hypothesis. Their goal was astonishingly explicit: to test the theory that Neanderthaloids developed out of the East Asian strains of Java and Pingman, and during the lush third interglacial period spread along the foothills of the Eurasian mountains into Europe. This was not speculation. It was an operational hypothesis. The phrase lush third interglacial refers to a warm verdant phase in Eurasia's climatic history when migration corridors running west from the Himalayas into Iran and onward into Anatolia would have been open to movement. The southern mountain arc Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Iran would have served as a natural highway. If Neanderthal ancestors expanded west during this time, then the discovery of Middle Paleolithic tools along this path was precisely what one would expect. In a dramatic and clear statement, Weidenreich placed the Asian hominin squarely before the Neanderthals in time and morphology, suggesting an unbroken chain from Java man to Peing man to Neanderthals. His view was not merely conjectural. It was based on the detailed anatomical comparisons of dozens of skulls, jaws, and teeth that he personally examined. He determined that the Neanderthal form could be regarded as a transitional structure exhibiting traits that pointed backward toward Homo erectus and forward toward modern humans. In this sense, the simplest explanation was that Neanderthals belonged centrally on the line of descent. If archaic forms from Java differed from modern humans less than they differed from each other, then the neat evolutionary ladders preferred by 20th-century textbooks collapsed into a complex biological continuum. These insights suggested that the Neanderthals were not a strange Western dead end, but only one expression of an ancient East-West population zone that persisted across tens or possibly hundreds of thousands of years. Weidenreich pressed this further. He observed that the morphology of the fossil samples in Europe and Asia did not differ in kind but only in degree. The variability among Neanderthals, Peking man and Java man mirrored the normal variability found among modern human populations. In one of his most pointed passages, he remarked that just as mankind of today represents a morphologic and generic unity in spite of its being divided into manifold races, so has it been during the entire time of evolution. This breathtaking sentence undermines the assumption that ancient hominin categories must represent distinct isolated branches. Instead, Weidenreich saw ancient evolution as he saw modern humanity, one species with regional variation. If this is true, then the later emergence of modern humans in Eurasia need not mark a replacement of one population by another, it can instead reflect a transformation within a world already populated by closely related groups among which Neanderthals were fully legitimate ancestors. The logical consequence of these observations is that the appearance of transitional forms in Europe and Asia at similar times need not imply independent origins. Rather, they reflect the movements of populations over immense territories. Weidenreich confronted the chronological objection directly. Critics argued that Neanderthals could not have descended from Asian hominids because transitional Neanderthal specimens in Europe appeared contemporaneous with Asian forms. He countered that the term ancestor should not be read literally as a direct blood relationship but instead as a description of an antecedent evolutionary type. He urged others to understand that evolutionary development might have occurred elsewhere earlier and that similar forms appearing in Europe later might only reflect migration rather than origin. His response is explicit. The stratigraphic evidence that the two types are not connected does not at all exclude the possibility that such a transformation took place in another part of the world. In other words, whether or not Europe holds the earliest transitional fossils is irrelevant. The most parsimonious explanation remains that evolution could have occurred eastward with westward migration producing later representatives in Europe. It is remarkable that recent fossil discoveries in China echo many of these early insights. Manifold races, so has it been during the entire time of evolution. This breathtaking sentence undermines the assumption that ancient hominin categories must represent distinct isolated branches. Instead, Weidenreich saw ancient evolution as he saw modern humanity, one species with regional variation. If this is true, then the later emergence of modern humans in Eurasia need not mark a replacement of one population by another, it can instead reflect a transformation within a world already populated by closely related groups among which Neanderthals were fully legitimate ancestors. The logical consequence of these observations is that the appearance of transitional forms in Europe and Asia at similar times need not imply independent origins. Rather, they reflect the movements of populations over immense territories. Weidenreich confronted the chronological objection directly. Critics argued that Neanderthals could not have descended from Asian hominids because transitional Neanderthal specimens in Europe appeared contemporaneous with Asian forms. He countered that the term ancestor should not be read literally as a direct blood relationship but instead as a description of an antecedent evolutionary type. He urged others to understand that evolutionary development might have occurred elsewhere earlier and that similar forms appearing in Europe later might only reflect migration rather than origin. His response is explicit. The stratigraphic evidence that the two types are not connected does not at all exclude the possibility that such a transformation took place in another part of the world. In other words, whether or not Europe holds the earliest transitional fossils is irrelevant. The most parsimonious explanation remains that evolution could have occurred eastward with westward migration producing later representatives in Europe. It is remarkable that recent fossil discoveries in China echo many of these early insights. The Jungian skulls, for example, show a mosaic of features traditionally associated with Neanderthals alongside traits found in other archaic humans. These discoveries demonstrate that Asia was home not to isolated evolutionary sidelines, but to vigorous populations that contributed genetically and morphologically to later humans. The implication is that Eurasia was not a passive recipient of newcomers, but an engine of evolutionary change. If Neanderthal and Denisovan roots run deep in Asia, then the third interglacial migration model gains new credibility. It would no longer seem extraordinary that Neanderthals arose from East Asian strains. Instead, it would appear natural. Once again, the most parsimonious explanation is that hominin evolution flowed through Eurasia as well as Africa, and that the ancient boundaries drawn on 20th-century maps may not reflect biological reality. In reality, we are not an African species. We are an Afro-Eurasian species. Modern humans never belonged to a single continent. Weidenreich was not shy about drawing dramatic conclusions. He repeatedly insisted that ancient hominins should be interpreted not as isolated taxonomic novelties, but as components of a dynamic interconnected species. This was not fringe. It was mainstream debate. In fact, in the 1960s, a major anthropological convention published a book which recommended all large-brained human fossils be classified in two groups, Homo sapiens and Homo erectus. Under this system, Neanderthals were classified as a subspecies of Homo sapiens. So then the modern tendency to treat Neanderthals as evolutionary cousins rather than ancestors did not arise from fact, but from conceptual preference. The neat story of a single African exodus with total replacement is attractive because it is simple, but simplicity is not truth. The third interglacial hypothesis, though older, is more consistent with the tangled evidence. It allows for ongoing contact, hybridization, regional development, and morphological blending. It eliminates the need to imagine abrupt population disappearances. For decades, this theory remained dormant. But the renewed discovery of archaic fossils across China and Central Asia along with genetic findings indicating deep interbreeding has begun to reawaken the older narrative. If Neanderthals did in fact emerge from Asian hominins and if they later contributed substantially to the ancestry of Eurasian populations, then the stark boundary between Neanderthal and modern human becomes a fiction. Weidenreich's view would triumph. Neanderthals would be recognized not as a dead end but as a major force in shaping later humans. The entire framework of human evolution would tilt. Africa remains important, but Eurasia will rise to equal status as a center of hominin evolution. In this lens, the third interglacial migration hypothesis becomes not a discarded relic but a viable alternative model. It weaves together fossils, archaeology and genetics with surprising elegance. It suggests that ancient Eurasia teemed with hominins who gave rise to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and even populations ancestral to modern humans. It proposes that Eurasia was never empty, but constantly inhabited by evolving migrating people. It restores complexity to an evolutionary saga that has too often been flattened into a slogan. Whether this model ultimately prevails remains to be seen, but its return marks a turning point. We are now confronted with the possibility that the earliest architects of human paleontologists were correct. Neanderthal ancestors migrated westward during a lush interglacial age. And if this proves true, then nothing in the textbooks will remain untouched. Human evolution will be rewritten, not as a single exodus, but as the continuous weaving of ancient lineages over the vast canvas of Eurasia. And that means the history of human evolution is not a straight road but a braided river with powerful currents flowing both directions across Eurasia. Thus the out-of-Africa theorists that tell you that modern humans evolved in a Garden of Eden in East Africa for 2 million years in total isolation and never interbred with other groups until they burst out of Africa 50,000 years ago is seeming more and more like a child's fairy tale. The hypothesis of Neanderthal origins in Asia, first proposed nearly a century ago, is back. And this time it arrives armed with new fossils, new genes, and old warnings from scholars whose work had been discarded only because they were ahead of their time. It is not the final word, but it is no longer ignorable. The story of human evolution is about to change again. Thanks for watching.